History is written in parades. We are shown the images of victory played again and again until they burn into our minds as unquestionable truth. Hitler lost, the Allies won, and the world was saved. This is the story every schoolchild learns, the story every statesman repeats, the story etched into the monuments of London, Washington, and even Moscow. But victory, like truth, is never simple. For wars are not merely about battles fought, or territories conquered, or flags raised over ruined cities. Wars are also about the debts that linger long after the gun falls silent. They are about the hollowing of nations, the scars etched into economies, and the shadows cast across generations. On the surface, yes, Hitler lost. His Reich was reduced to rubble, his armies shattered, his ambitions exposed as madness. He ended his life in a bunker, alone, hunted, despised. That image, the coward's end of a tyrant, is meant to reassure us that good triumphed over evil. But what if I told you that the very act of defeating Hitler extracted a cost greater than the war itself? That the nations who declared victory bled themselves dry in order to win? That in the ashes of Berlin and Britain, it was not simply Germany that lay defeated, but the old world itself? Do you see, the illusion of victory, it blinds us. It tells us the story we want to believe, that the war ended, that the victors rose stronger, that sacrifice secured freedom. Yet, if you trace the lines of history forward, the story begins to twist. Empires collapse, economies shatter, nations live not in triumph, but in austerity, in rationing, in endless debt. So, the question must be asked, what is this victory worth if it cost you the very strength you sought to preserve? Did Hitler really lose in 1945, or did his shadow win by reshaping the entire future of Europe? The illusion is powerful, a banner of pride, a shield against doubt. But illusions, no matter how comforting, eventually give way to truth. And the truth, uncomfortable as it may be, is this: the world we inherited after 1945 looks far less like a victory and far more like a bargain struck with ruin. When we think of Hitler's ambitions, our minds leap first to the east, to the vast plains of Russia, the Lebensraum he promised his people, the endless expansion he dreamed of. Yet, beneath those grand designs lay another, more immediate obsession: Britain. Not merely Britain the island, but Britain the empire, the vast dominion upon which the sun never set. The empire that controlled seas, trade routes, resources, and colonies spanning half the bloody globe. An empire built over centuries, ruling not by numbers, but by prestige, by the idea that Britain was truly untouchable. Hitler understood something many of his enemies could not, that Britain's power was not in tanks or divisions, but in wealth, in finance, in the invisible threads of commerce, and an empire that bound the world to London. If he could not conquer the island by force, he could bleed it until the very fabric of that empire unraveled. And so the war unfolded. The Luftwaffe rained fire on London, not just to break morale, but to force Britain into a war it could not afford. Hitler's armies swept across Europe, forcing Churchill to defend the continent with borrowed resources and borrowed time. Every day Britain fought, it grew weaker. Every ship sunk, every plane lost, every shell fire drained the reserves of a nation that lived not on landmass, but on credit. Churchill would later call it Britain's finest hour. But finest hours come at a cost. To resist Hitler, Britain poured everything into survival. Gold reserves were shipped to America, sterling was weakened, loans were taken in staggering amounts, debts signed that would last not years, but generations. Britain clung on, yes, but at the price of our future. This was the true target. Hitler didn't need to set foot on British soil to cripple his greatest rival. He only needed to force Britain into a war it could not win on its own terms. A war that would empty its vaults, hollow out its empire, and shatter its illusion of eternal dominance. And it was in this he succeeded. For though Britain stood undefeated in 1945, it stood exhausted, bankrupt, and broken. The empire was mortgaged to survival. The lion had not been slain, but it had been fatally wounded beyond recovery. You see, survival always comes with a price, and Britain in the Second World War paid a price greater than any victory parade could ever disguise. When Churchill declared that Britain would never surrender, he was right. Britain did not surrender to Hitler. Instead, it surrendered to debt, to necessity, to the cold arithmetic of survival. Every gun fired, every plane built, every convoy protected across the Atlantic, all of it drained the veins of the empire. The Bank of England's gold reserves were shipped across the ocean to pay for American weapons and supplies. And by 1941, Britain was living on credit it could not afford to pay. And when Roosevelt signed Lend-Lease into law, it saved Britain militarily. But it also placed Britain on a leash of American finance from which, even to this day, it would never be free. This is the untold story of the war, that while Britain stood against Hitler, it sold its future piece by piece to stay alive. Loans piled up loans, resources mortgaged, promises made that would outlive the war itself. By 1945, Britain emerged not as a triumphant empire, but as the world's largest debtor. And the cost of survival did not end when the bombs stopped falling. Rationing continued into the 1950s. Entire industries collapsed under the weight of wartime exhaustion. The welfare state was not born from prosperity, but from desperation. A people exhausted, demanding the barest comforts in the ruins of victory. Britain had survived the war, yes, but in surviving, it had broken its spine. The empire that once dominated the globe now existed only on borrowed time. America had become the creditor. The colonies had seen Britain's weakness. Independence movements stirred in India, in Africa, in the Middle East. The war had not preserved the empire. It had effectively signed its death warrant. This is the cruel paradox of Britain's Second World War. To win it, it had to destroy itself. To survive, it had to bleed out its wealth, its empire, its global standing. Churchill's speeches promised glory, but glory does not pay its debts. Flags can wave, but ledgers do not lie. So we must ask, when the price of survival is the end of everything you sought to preserve, is that truly victory? Or is it? Is it the slow, quiet kind of defeat that history and its records prefer, that we didn't name? Empires do not collapse in a single day. They unravel, thread by thread, banner by banner, until the fabric that once held half the world together lies in tatters. For Britain, the Second World War was not the preservation of empire, it was the beginning of its end. Before 1939, Britain commanded the oceans from Cairo to Calcutta, from Cape Town to Hong Kong. The Union Jack flew over more land and more people than any other flag in history. Britain was not just a country, it was the world order. But the war changed everything. The empire was not simply strained, it was broken. The resources once used to govern faraway colonies were consumed to the desperate fight for survival at home. The armies that once policed India and Africa were trained to fight in France, in North Africa, in the skies over Europe. The illusion of invincibility, the idea that Britain could never be displaced, was shattered the moment its people realized survival depended on American credit and Russian sacrifice. The colonies saw it too. In India, the war fanned the flames of independence. Britain promised freedom for support, but when the war ended, the promise could no longer be delayed. In 1947, just 2 years after victory in Europe, India was gone. The jewel of the crown slipped away, and with it, the very heart of Britain's imperial pride. Elsewhere, the unravelling accelerated. In the Middle East, the Suez Canal, one of Britain's lifelines to the East, became a battlefield of influence. Until 1956, the Suez Crisis exposed Britain's weakness to the world. In Africa, nations long held in colonial grip began to rise, their independence movements fueled not just by nationalism, but by the clear evidence that Britain was no longer the unshakable empire it once claimed to be. It is no coincidence that decades after the war saw the empire fold in on itself, Britain had spent everything to survive Hitler, and in doing so, lost the ability to hold its empire together. This is the bitter irony. Hitler never landed a single soldier on British shores, yet he succeeded in destroying the very thing Britain went to war to preserve. The empire was not beaten by invasion, but by exhaustion. The war was the poison, and it worked slowly, year by year, until the lion's roar faded into silence. The maps changed, the red ink of empire drained away, and Britain, once the masters of the world, found themselves reduced to an island among many, clinging to memory but stripped of its power. This is the true legacy of Hitler's war. The British Empire did not fall by his hand, but by his shadow. And in the ruins of victory, Britain learned the hardest lesson of all, that an empire can survive invasion, but it cannot survive bankruptcy. Germany in 1945 was rubble. Entire cities burned black, industries dismantled, millions dead, millions more displaced. To the world, it looked like the final proof of Hitler's failure, that his mad empire had been reduced to dust. And yet, history has a strange sense of irony, for in those ruins, in that utter destruction, Germany was given something Britain was not, the chance to be reborn. The Allies, fearful of repeating the mistakes of Versailles, poured billions into West Germany through the Marshall Plan. American money rebuilt German factories, modernized its industries, and reignited its economy. What had been flattered by bombs was reconstructed with the latest designs, the latest technology. Germany entered the post-war years not with crumbling infrastructure and outdated industry, but with a clean slate. A slate filled by American dollars and American investment. Meanwhile, Britain staggered under the weight of debt. Our factories were old, our industry strained, our cities damaged, but not renewed. We limped forward with rationing that lasted until 1954, while German families were already experiencing the Wurstwaffe, the economic miracle. British families still queued for butter, still counted every loaf of fucking bread. Think on the irony. The aggressor, reduced to ashes, was rebuilt into an industrial powerhouse. The victor, hailed as triumphant, languished in austerity, clinging to a fading empire and a mountain of debt. By the 1960s, West Germany had surpassed Britain in economic strength. Its exports dominated Europe. Its industries, steel cars, machinery, set new standards. The very nation that Britain had supposedly defeated was now rising above it, outpacing it and outshadowing it. And this, perhaps, is the cruelest ghost of Hitler's victory. Though the man himself lay dead in a Berlin bunker, his nation, his people, were rebuilt stronger than ever before. While Britain never fully recovered, he had wanted to break Britain, and though he failed militarily, history did the work for him. It is as though his shadow whispered across time, "You may destroy me, but in destroying me, you will destroy yourselves." And in the decades that followed, that prophecy played out with an utter cold precision. So tell me, when the defeated enemy rises stronger than the victor, when the nation that stood alone against Hitler is the very one left behind in his wake, can we truly say he lost? Or does his ghost still walk among us? Not in salutes and swastikas, but in the quiet humiliation of Britain's financial decline. This is what we must consider when we analyse the total cost of the war, lest we forget and we suffer once more. You see, many lost their lives, and for what, I wonder. If Hitler's armies had marched across Europe and endured, the world would look very different today. But even in defeat, he left behind a world that bore his fingerprints. The Reich fell, yet the shape of the post-war order was defined by his shadow. First, the division of the world itself. Before Hitler, Europe was the center of power, the engine of empires. After Hitler, Europe was broken, carved into two halves, east and west, a battleground not of nations, but of ideologies. The Cold War was not born in Moscow, nor in Washington, but in Berlin. It was Hitler's war that split the globe into two armed camps, locked in a struggle that lasted half a century. Second, the rise of America. Before the war, the United States was a reluctant giant, powerful but inward-looking. Hitler changed that. By dragging Britain into debt, by wrecking Europe's economies, he handed America the keys to global dominance. The dollar became the backbone of world finance. Washington, not London, became the new imperial capital. The torch of leadership did not pass willingly. It was forced out of Britain's dying hands by the war Hitler began. Third, the creation of NATO, the European Union, the United Nations, all of them systems born not from triumph, but from terror. from the determination that another Hitler must never rise again. And yet in this, he achieved a strange immortality. For 8 decades, politics, culture, and even morality have been measured against him. Every tyrant compared to Hitler, every act of aggression framed against 1939, his name has become a permanent reference point, the benchmark of evil, the yardstick of dictatorship. Think of that. A man who supposedly lost is still the axis in which modern history turns. The world order did not erase him. It was built in response to him. His crimes became the foundation stones of international law, of the Geneva Conventions, of human rights doctrines. His war crimes became the blueprint for tribunals and charters that define justice today. And perhaps the most unsettling of all, his shadow continues to shape how nations govern themselves. Germany's democracy is constructed like armor, designed to prevent another Führer. Britain's politics forever echoes the rhetoric of 1940, the finest hour invoked whenever crisis looms. America justifies its interventions by invoking the ghost of Munich, the warning that appeasement breeds monsters. This is the world he made, a world where his defeat did not erase him, but enshrined him, a world reordered by the destruction he unleashed, a world where every lesson, every alliance, every warning sign is written in his name. He is gone, his Reich is gone, but his imprint remains, pressed deep into the soil of the 20th century, and today it still remains clearly visible. And so I ask you, dear listeners, when a man shapes the entire future of the world, when his shadow still dictates our politics, our fears, our alliances, can we say he truly lost? Or did he carve a dark and lasting victory from the ashes of his defeat? And now we come to the final irony, the truth that history whispers yet rarely shouts. Hitler lost the war, that is undeniable. His armies were crushed, his cities burned, his empire erased. Yet, in losing, he won in a way no battlefield could ever measure. Consider Britain, the nation that stood alone, that fought with courage, that defied the Luftwaffe and endured the Blitz. We imagine triumph in those years of sacrifice. But look closer. The empire that Britain sought to preserve was gone within a decade. The colonies that sustained its wealth declared independence. The gold that funded the war had left the nation indebted for generations. The industrial might we once commanded was surpassed by Germany, rebuilt stronger and faster than we could ever have imagined. Victory, in the end, was hollow. We survived Hitler, but we did not survive his war unscathed. We were beaten not by bombs, but by the very cost of resisting him. Every pound spent, every life lost, every day of rationing, those were the tolls we paid for survival. And in paying them, we ceded the power that we had long claimed as ours. And Germany, the defeated, rose again, with American aid, with lessons learned from failure, with a world that feared yet depended on its resurgence. The man who died in a bunker left a legacy of ruin, yet paradoxically, a rebirth for his own nation. So the final irony is this: Hitler's true victory was not in conquest, nor in ideology, nor in the fleeting terror of his war. His victory lies in the invisible threads that he left behind, in the bankruptcy of Britain, in the reshaping of Europe, and in the fear and order that still dictate international affairs to this day. The lion of the world may have survived, but it limped, wounded, hurting, and the shadow of the defeated monster still shapes the rules that very lion lives by today. History would like to tell you he lost. Facts tell us he failed. But when you measure not by battlefields, but by the long arc of influence, when you measure not by flags raised, but by the world left in ruins and in debt, then perhaps, just perhaps, Hitler won after all. This is the final irony, that a man who fell in defeat continues to walk among us, not in life but in consequence, that his war did not end in 1945, but with every nation that still lives under the weight of its aftershocks. That is his true victory. Silent and invisible is the price we continue to pay. And Britain, proud Britain, still stands. Yes, but it stands forever haunted by the war it survived, and by that victory that was never truly its own. And so we look back across the decades, across the ruins and the rebuilt cities, across the ledgers of debt and the maps of the lost empire. We see the victories, the parades, the photographs, and yet we must ask ourselves, what has truly changed? Hitler is dead, his Reich is gone, but the world he touched is not the same as the world it was before. Nations rise, nations fall, empires crumble, yet some shadows still remain. Some victories are truly invisible, and some wars are not fought on battlefields, but in the balance sheets, in economies, in the very psychology of a people. Britain survived, but the cost was the empire itself, the golden age of influence and the independence of its own future. Germany was crushed, yet it rose stronger, its industries reborn, and its position in the world reshaped by the ruin it was imposed upon others. History tells us who won, but history also whispers in the quiet corners of memory, in the debts still owed, in the politics still guided by fear. And it whispers the truth, that victory is not always what it seems, that defeat can sometimes carry the seed of triumph, and that the consequences of war do not end when the guns fall silent. We live today in a world still haunted by the war Hitler began, still shaped by the choices made to stop him. And perhaps in that haunting, in the invisible legacy, we finally have a glimpse of the deepest irony of all, that even in death, even in defeat, some men leave victories that time itself cannot erase. The war ended in 1945, but the cost, the unseen cost, lingers still. And Britain, proud Britain, great Britain, continues to bear it unknowingly in every step it takes across the world it once ruled as an empire. And this is the unseen story of the Second World War. The illusion and Hitler's victory. The uncomfortable truth that no one wants to admit or come to terms with, but it is the truth. A truth protected by the Secrets Act. A truth that me speaking about could very well be against the law of England. But I leave you with this somber thought. If this is the real truth, and the truth that was hidden from the history books, the truth hidden from the classroom, you must ask yourself why.